Tube amps suck. Really? Didn't I just review a whole slew of tube amps and talked about how beautiful they sounded, how exquisite they look, and how cool it is just to run a tube amp where you sit back and the tubes might glow and give you that warm and fuzzy feeling? So if all this is the case, why did I make a thumbnail that says tube amps suck? Well, I was chatting with an old audiophile buddy just yesterday, and he saw my recent review of the Cayin 805A. He also saw the review of the Soul. He also saw the review of the Carry 300 SCI, the Oil Lily 300B amp. I've reviewed a bunch of tube amps just recently, and I have to admit it was for my own personal selfish reasons. I wanted to see what I've been missing because it's been years since I've owned a tube amp. But anyway, this friend of mine, he said, I've tried the tube thing and it's always a pain in the butt. It costs a fortune to retube, and he started going down this list of negatives about tube amps. And yes, I've touched on this before, but I'm going to touch on it deeply in this video. And no, I don't believe tube amps suck, but I do believe a lot of them, many of them, maybe even most of them, are using the same technology and formulas from the 70s. So tube amps. I'm also going to talk about the different types of tube amps. I'm going to talk about tube amps compared to solid state. I'm going to talk about Class A, Class AB, and Class D sound, where it stands today. But first of all, tube amps are cool. I told you right in the beginning of this video what I think of tube amps. I love the glow, I love the beauty, and sub-tube amps, specifically the single-ended triode variety, offers something unique and very special in the sound quality department. But let's talk right out the gate of the negatives of tube amps, and there are negatives. The tube costs for replacement can be high if you have a tube amp that uses some of the most expensive tubes like 805s, 845s, 300B. Those tubes are all pretty pricey, approaching, the $1,000 level if you want to get good ones. And I've known people, and I've done it myself, where I spent $1,200, $2,000 to retube an amp, and a week later, one of those tubes blow. That's very frustrating. I've even seen in the shops, somebody's Line Magnetic 219IA was so blown, it melted parts of the metal together. It was crazy. So tube amps, especially the more exotic type, like the single-ended triodes, they can be expensive to retube. They can blow out. Also, tube amps such as that, the Class A variety of tube amps. Now, Class A, I'll talk about that sound here in a minute, what I've learned and experienced over the years from these types of amps. But Class A tube amps can get really hot. Single-ended triode tube amps can get really hot. Those 845 and 805 tubes, let them run for an hour. You put your hand on it, you will scald the skin right off your hand. In small rooms, they can be like a little space heater. So that's one of the cons of a tube amp. The second con of the tube amp, with the cost replacement being high for tubes. The third con of a tube amp like that, a Class A, for example, it can cost a lot more in your electricity. Now, I say a lot more, but maybe when I had a Class A tube amp, a single-ended triode, and I listen a lot, I think my bill went up by 30, 40 bucks a month. It can get that high depending on how much you listen. So they're not efficient. Some of them can make little buzzing sounds from the transformers. So there's a lot going on with a tube amp, but yet when you get a good one and you turn it on and you listen to it, it can be a magical thing where you are totally immersed in the music, a 3D holographic soundscape, and none really do that effect better, that experience better than a Class A single-ended triode. Now, I'm talking specifically, I've just been listening to the Cayin 805A again If you didn't see that review, I just posted it here on the channel. So tube amps do have maintenance. Some of them you have to bias, some of them have auto bias. There's Class A/B tube amps, which have a different sound than the Class A tube amps. And the Class A/B tube amps don't run as hot. They're a little gentler on the tubes. They're not as noisy. But in reality, a Class A/B tube amp doesn't sound too far off from a really good solid state amp, depending on the amp you're listening to. So let's talk about the different types of amps before we go on and compare, bit by bit, a tube amp to a solid state amp. And I'm going to tell you my preference at the end, what I prefer. For me, after 35, 40 years, almost 40 years now of being in this hobby. So there's Class A, Class AB, Class D. Class A offers a sound besides the heat. We can get Class A in tube amps or solid state amps. I used to run Passlabs XA60.8s. They were Class A monoblocks. They cost quite a bit to power when listening for hours every day. I've also had Class A tube amps, the Line Magnetics, the Kayans. Class A sound is different from the rest. It's a little more immediate, a little more present, a little more tipped up. The details seem to be a little more exposed coming out into the room, even more than other types of amplifiers. A Class A amp should have a really crystalline top end, a beautiful mid-range that is not bloated or thickened, but rather clear and clean and pretty holographic. The bass of most Class A amps is pretty solid and pretty big. Passlabs does this very well. The Kayans do this very well, whether it's tube or solid state. So the Class A sound is immediate, present. Wow, beautiful. Listen to some vocals. They're going to sound real, and everything's going to be transparent, clean and clear, but you're still going to get that big bass in the bottom without that bloat in the mids. So Class A should bring this type of sound. What about Class AB? Now we can find Class AB tube amps. We can find Class AB solid state amps. Most of the HiFi integrated amplifiers today are of the Class AB variety, right? Class AB has a sound that's a little bit warmer, a little bit thicker, especially in that mid-range. Voices might sound larger than life, a little bit bigger and bloated. The top end is still going to bring out the detail, but it's going to be a little more muted than a Class A design. The bass of a Class AB can be thunderous, big, powerful, great for EDM, great for heavy metal, that kind of music. But you're not going to have the all-out clarity of a Class A design. Now, some people crave that Class A clarity, and others crave that beef, that backbone, that bass in the mid-range of a Class AB design. So that's the difference between the sound. Now, a Class AB amp, they'll either run cool or slightly warm. They're not going to get red hot and heat the room. They're going to be more efficient to run. They're not going to be as expensive to power as a Class A. So that leads me into Class D. Now, it's been, I think, 20 years Class D has been around, maybe. I remember going into a shop well over a decade ago, and they were trying to sell me on their brand new Class D power amplifier. And the salesman said, "You've never heard anything like this. It's 1,000 watts per channel. It's going to blow your mind." Well, he played some music, and I was like, wow, that is impressive for the power and the dynamics. But even so, it sounded a little flat, a little hard, and a little edgy. Back then, the early Class D is quite different from the Class D of today. Now, today, we have brands making Class D amps that use GaN technology. I've talked about this at length in other videos. I've reviewed many GaN Class D amps, and they do have a little bit of a different sound than, say, the standard Class D amp. The GaN amps seem to have a little bit more warmth injected in the mids, but overall, the Class D sound today can be quite remarkable. I talked about it in the Deviollet Astra review. And that is still the best integrated amp I've ever heard or experienced in my lifetime. I'm talking sound quality, features, ease of use, beauty and design. It's a modern day Class D masterpiece, but that thing cost $20,000 to $25,000. So that's going to take deep wallets to get to that level of Class D. Other brands, AGD, for example, I loved their monoblocks. I bought them in chrome and I still miss them. I buy these things and then I see something else and I'm like, ooh, I like this a little better. I have to sell to buy the new thing. And since I do what I do here, I like to keep things fresh. But the AGD duets were very, very nice. They had a smooth sound, but a lot of dynamic energy, a lot of power, a little bit smooth on the top. The mid-range was kind of like Class A. It wasn't bloated or thick. And the bass was just a little bit lighter than the Class A designs that I love so much. But going back to Class D, there's low-end Class D where you can buy for $100 an amp on Amazon. To me, those sound like old Class D. They're a little bit flat. They're a little bit edgy. They don't have the holographics or the backbone. But then you get into some really nice Class D amps. Orchard Audio makes some great Class D amps. There's tons of them out there. HiFi Rose, they have a couple of integrateds I reviewed that use Class D GAN, and they sound smooth, big, and powerful. They're not going to have the all-out detail holographics as a Class A, and they're not going to have all that beef and warmth of a Class AB, so they're somewhere in the middle. But for me, the Devialet Astra was a revelation to me. That to me is the pinnacle right now anyway of Class D amplification. It's really, really fantastic. Now, what about tubes versus solid state? Now, tubes bring that retro vibe. You know, you sit back with your glass of wine or your whiskey and you're soaking in that beautiful tube sound. Now, Class A to me is the definition of beautiful tube sound, but there's also something like the K and Soul that's Class AB that when you put it in triode mode, it brings just enough of that sweetness to really sound beautiful, expansive. But a good Class A like the 805A or the Line Magnetics, they bring out a holographic stage. They're beautiful, they're big, they're bold, they're clean, but they offer enough bass in there to not ever sound lean. Tube amps can be remarkable, and I've never found a solid state amp, never, that sounds like a single-ended triode amp, but those single-ended triode tube amps are the most expensive to retube. They run the hottest. They might have a little buzz from the transformers, so you have those cons involved when you're buying an amp like that. Solid state, there are so many amazing amplifiers you can get in solid state. So many brands, too numerous to mention. Anywhere from Class A, Class AB to Class D. And for me personally, after 40 years of doing this and hearing hundreds of amps, many tube amps, many solid state amps, today, right now, as of November 2025, and for the last couple of years really, I've really been a solid state guy, and here's why. Solid state Class D, I should say, has been where I'm leaning, where I'm headed. Runs cool, surgically silent, no noise whatsoever. The noise floor of the amps are very surgically silent as well. So you're not getting any noise from the music, and you're not getting any noise from big transformers that are 1970s technology. You're getting modernism right here. So Class D solid state for me, when done right, when done beautifully right, surpasses AB for me, surpasses Class A for me, because while I might enjoy the sound of a Class A set amp a little bit more than a Class D, something like the Astra, I take everything into consideration. The Astra is efficient. It doesn't cost a fortune to power. It doesn't ever get hot. It runs normal temperature. You can set your hand on it and it doesn't even feel warm when running. It has massive power and can power any speaker made today. But the sound of good Class D delivers a holographic sound stage. Beautiful bass, richness, depth in the layering of that sound stage. And I look for the day, I'm going to guess in 1 to 2 years, maybe 3, we'll get the sound quality of Class A, Class AB in Class D. We'll get the sound quality of that Astra in something that costs $3,000. I've heard a lot of Class D amps, and a lot of them sound really, really good these days. A lot of beautiful choices. And I always tell people, you know, go with your heart, go with what works in your system and your room with your speakers. So that's my thoughts on solid state versus tubes. Yeah, and I choose solid state for the convenience, zero maintenance, etc., etc. So no, tube amps don't suck. They're just different. They're just offer up a different experience. There's nothing wrong with tube amps. So I wrote my friend back and I said, tube amps rule. It's cool to have one of each. Have a tube amp on hand and have your favorite solid state amp on hand. And those days when you get tired of the solid state, plug in that tube amp and enjoy the sounds. And when that becomes a little too much for your brain, go back to your solid state. That's what I like to do. I like to switch between them both. I might listen for a month to solid state, and then I go a month with the tubes. I love them both. I love it all, but I am an audio geek and an audio nerd. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this little video. It's just me sitting here talking to you guys, and I have a lot more reviews on the way. As always, I love you all, and I will see you in the next one.